540-foot poles lay stacked and rotting along a Mississippi fence line. The utility man offered her a disposal form and a patient, condescending smile. She opened her grandfather's journal to a page of hand-drawn pole framing. 8 months later, the storm hit, and the barn did not move. Dawn came up gray over the Mississippi coastal plain, and Greta Hollis walked her fence line with the brass folding rule out of her right hip pocket, snapping it open, snapping it shut, counting. Not measuring, counting. 1 click per pole. That was how her grandfather had taught her to count anything past 50. Give your hands a job so your head doesn't lose the number. She got to 460 before the fog burned off, and there were more past the bend. 40 acres. That's what the Hollis place was. And 40 acres on that stretch of coastal plain in 1983 meant sandy loam that drained too fast, a pond that went green in August, and a hayfield that had been let go so long the broom sedge had taken the high corner. There was a house with a tin roof, a smokehouse leaning south, and where the barn used to be, there was a concrete slab and a scatter of splintered lumber, and one lonely corner post standing up out of it like a broken tooth. The storm had taken the barn 11 months back. Straight-line winds, 90-some miles an hour, and the whole structure came apart at the joints because it had been built in 1936 out of green pine and hope. Greta had watched the roof go from the kitchen window. She'd been 23 then. Earl Hollis died 8 months after that, in his chair, with the radio on. He left her the 40, a shed full of tools with worn handles, and a black canvas-bound field journal with a rubber band around it. 51 years of weather notes, hay yields, seed prices, and in the margins, the things he actually thought. Greta read it at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold, in her faded olive work shirt with the sleeves rolled, and about a third of the way in, she found the sentence he used to say out loud when somebody threw something away in front of him. Waste is just a failure of imagination. He'd say it about corn shucks, about busted pallets, about a neighbor hauling perfectly good cedar to the dump because it had a knot in it. He said it so often, it stopped registering as wisdom and started sounding like a tick. She underlined it, twice. Now, the county line. The utility district had been replacing the old distribution run along Cutter Road all that spring. New poles, new crossarms, new everything. Because a substation upgrade meant the old wood couldn't carry the load. The crews worked their way east through March and April. And every pole they pulled, they laid down in the right-of-way, which happened to be the ditch bank on the north edge of the Hollis property. 500 of them. Southern yellow pine, 40 feet each, pressure-treated with creosote clear through the sapwood, roughly 1,100 pounds apiece. Butt ends the diameter of a dinner plate, tapering to about 7 inches at the top. Most of them had been in the ground since 1954, and the ground had done exactly nothing to them, because that's what creosote is for. 1.5 miles of timber, lying in the weeds, 30 feet from her fence. Greta walked it every morning for a week. She kicked them. She got down and looked at the checking in the grain. She took her knife and cut into a butt end and found wood the color of dark honey, dense, tight-ringed, hard enough to turn the blade. Old-growth pine, the kind nobody was cutting anymore, seasoned 3 decades in open air. The utility district, meanwhile, saw a line item. Donald Pruitt drove out on a Tuesday in a district truck, and he came up the drive in a pressed navy suit jacket and oxblood shoes he clearly did not intend to get muddy. Steel clipboard against his chest, ballpoint on a little chain, wire-rimmed glasses. He rocked back on his heels when he stopped walking, chin tipped up, and he looked at the concrete slab where the barn had been, and then he looked at her. "You're the granddaughter," he said, not a question. "Whole place is yours now?" Greta stood, squared up, hands open at her sides, and said it was. Pruitt smiled. That was the thing about the man. He smiled the entire time. He explained, patiently, the way you'd explain a stove to somebody who might touch it, that the poles in the right-of-way were classified as treated wood waste, and that removal was quoted through a contracted hauler at $75 per unit. 500 units. That's $37,500. He let that sit. Then he tapped the clipboard. Now, the district doesn't bill landowners for that, ordinarily, but we're backed up till fall, and I'd hate for a nice girl out here alone to be looking at that mess through the winter. He glanced at her boots, the red laces, the mud on them. Alternative is, you take title, salvage transfer, $1. Then they're yours, and honestly, sweetheart, that's the most anybody's ever going to give you for free out here. She didn't answer yet, so he kept going, because men like that always keep going. I'll be straight with you. It's junk wood. Nobody wants it. Can't burn it, can't chip it, can't sell it. Landfills won't take treated timber without a permit. He looked past her at the wreck of the barn, and his mouth did something small and pleased. Some folks inherit a farm. Some folks inherit a problem. You seem like a smart enough girl to know which one you got. He said it kindly. That's what made it filth. Greta looked at the ditch bank for a second. 500 pieces of old-growth pine, cured to the core, arrow straight, that no rot and no termite and no 30 years of Gulf weather had ever managed to touch. I'll need a receipt, she said. Nothing else. Not one word more. Word got to the feed store in Cutter by Thursday, the way it does. Lowell Bracey was in there with his straw hat in both hands, arms going to his chest when he laughed, and he told it to 4 men at the counter. Earl's girl, taking the power company's garbage, signing for it, paying $1 for a ditch full of poison logs because she can't afford lumber like a person. They laughed the easy laugh of men who have never once been wrong out loud. And Pruitt laid the salvage transfer flat on the hood of his truck, smiling that patient smile, and reminded her, hauling them, of course, was entirely her problem. She signed it. The receipt went into her shirt pocket, folded in thirds, and Greta stood at the edge of the right-of-way, looking at 1.5 miles of dead utility poles that were now, legally, hers. 500 of them. Creosote black, some of them 50 years in the ground, cut off at the base by a crew that hadn't bothered to look back. They lay where they'd dropped, in the drainage ditch, across the fence line, half sunk in the soft red clay that runs alongside County Road 14 in Perry County, Mississippi. A southern yellow pine pole, 35 feet long, Class 4, soaked through with a half-century of rain, weighs somewhere north of 1,100 pounds. Some of the butt sections went 1,300. She had a 1968 Ford 4000 tractor with a bad third gear. She had a flatbed trailer with wooden decking. She had no crane, no boom truck, no loader, and no crew, unless you counted a 24-year-old woman with a single loose braid down her back and her sleeves rolled past the elbow. Do the math the way Donald Pruitt did it, standing there in his pressed navy suit with the clipboard against his chest, rocking on those polished oxblood shoes. He'd done the math out loud, actually, before he handed her the pen. You understand these aren't lumber, sweetheart. They're liability. A contractor with a knuckle boom quoted us $75 a pole to remove them. That's $37,500 of a problem. And you just bought it for $1. Then the smile. Some people can't tell the difference between an opportunity and a hole in the ground. He drove off, certain she'd call him inside a month, begging him to take it back. She didn't call anybody. She went home and got the journal. Earl's field journal, black canvas, rubber band around it, the corners gone soft as cloth from 30 years under his left arm. She'd read it front to back twice already, but she went looking for a specific page. The one he'd drawn the winter he salvaged a bridge timber out of the Leaf River bottom by himself at 71 years old, with a bad hip and nobody to help. 2 parallel skids, 2 chains, 1 winch. He'd sketched it in pencil, crooked lines, his handwriting slanted hard to the right. Parbuckle. Don't lift it, roll it. Here's the thing your hands teach you before your brain catches up. If you try to lift 1,100 pounds, you're fighting the whole weight at once. But if you run a chain under the pole and up over it, anchor one end of the trailer, and pull the other end with a winch, the pole becomes a pulley of itself. The chain wraps as it turns. You get a 2-to-1 mechanical advantage, and you're not lifting anything. You're rolling it up an inclined plane. 550 pounds of pull instead of 1,100. Her hand-crank cable winch was rated for 2,000. On paper, it was easy. Paper is a liar. First attempt, a Tuesday morning in September, humidity like a wet towel over the face. She set the skids at what looked right. 2 8-foot oak planks running from the ditch bank to the trailer deck, maybe a 35-degree pitch. Ran the chains, cranked. The pole came up about 18 inches. She felt it, that live, heavy shudder coming up the cable into her wrists, the whole system talking to her. Then the chain slipped sideways off the round of the pole. All that stored tension went somewhere it wasn't supposed to, and the right-hand skid split down its length with a crack like a rifle. The pole dropped, rolled, and went back into the ditch it had come out of. Mud up her trousers to the knee, cable slack in her hands. She stood there, squared, weight even on both feet, hands hanging open at her sides. Looked at the broken skid for a long time. Then she took the brass folding rule out of her right hip pocket, Earl's initials stamped into the end of it, worn nearly smooth, and she started measuring. The angle was the sin. 35 degrees meant the chain wanted to slide toward the low end of the pole instead of biting. It also meant the vertical load on the skids was too concentrated, which is why the oak gave up. She dragged the skids out to 14 feet and reset them at something closer to 18 degrees. A longer, lazier ramp, more distance to travel, far less force at every point along it. That's the trade. You always pay in one currency or the other, distance or force, never neither. Then the chain. One wrap wasn't holding on a wet, tapered, creosote-slick log. She doubled the wrap and set the second loop about 4 feet inboard of the first, so the 2 bites bracketed the pole's balance point and pinched instead of slid. She nailed a stop cleat across the top of each skid so nothing could run backward on her. Somewhere in the middle of the second re-rig, a truck slowed on the road behind her. Lowell Bracey. Arms crossed, straw hat on the seat beside him, gray mustache and those bushy brows and 40 years of cattle in Perry County behind his eyes. He watched her kneel in the ditch mud and hammer a cleat into oak. He watched a woman try to move a 1,200-pound pole with hand tools and a tractor older than she was. He said nothing at all. He put the truck in gear and drove off. That's the part nobody tells you about. Not the laughing, the not laughing. The pity that doesn't even bother to open its mouth. Have you ever kept working while somebody watched you fail and decided you weren't worth a word? She cranked, the chain bit, the pole turned, slow, grudging, a full quarter revolution, then another, and rolled up 14 feet of oak and dropped onto the trailer decking with a boom she felt in her sternum. The sun was going down orange over the pine line. Her palms were raw. Her braid had come half apart, wisps stuck to her temples. She pulled the journal out, licked the pencil, and made a single vertical mark in the margin beside Earl's sketch. 1. 499 to go. Pole 2 came easier. Pole 3 took 40 minutes because the butt end had sunk into the clay and she had to dig it out with a spade before the winch would pull. That's how it went. Every morning that autumn, before the light was real, Greta Hollis was out on the old right-of-way with the truck idling and her breath showing white. 6 poles on a bad day, 8 on a good one. She kept the count in the margin of Earl's black canvas journal, 4 tally marks and a slash through them, page after page, the pencil going soft and blunt against damp paper. 11 weeks of that. Rain, most of it. Mississippi in October doesn't rain so much as sweat. Everything slick and heavy, and the smell of wet creosote so thick it got into her hair, her collar, the truck seat, the pillowcase. Fuel came to $312 over the whole haul. She logged every fill-up, right there beside the tallies. 31 cents a pole, moved 11 miles. Try beating that at a lumber yard. But hauling isn't the story. Any fool with a winch can drag dead wood across a field. What separated her from a fool was what she did once the poles were stacked. She bought a hand auger, a 2-inch increment borer, the kind foresters use to core a living tree, and she went down the stacks one at a time, boring into the butt end and pulling out a pencil-thin plug of wood. Then she'd hold it up in the gray light and read it like a page. Here's what she was reading for. Creosote doesn't soak all the way through a pole. It penetrates the sapwood, that outer band of younger, thirstier fiber, and stops cold at the heartwood, because heartwood is already dead and closed and won't drink. On a good pole, you get 2.5–3 inches of dark chocolate brown penetration, sharp-edged, then a clean line, then pale honey-colored heart. That sharp line is the whole ballgame. It means the treatment took evenly. It means fungus and termites hit a wall 3 inches deep on every face. She found poles with 4 inches. She found poles where the dark band went in 1/2 inch and then went splotchy, and those she set aside. 43 poles got rejected. Some had check cracks running the length, seasoning splits that opened past the treated shell and let weather straight into the raw heart. Some cored out soft and brown at the center, rot that had started at the top and worked down inside the pole where nobody could see it, the outside still looking like 100 years of service left in it. She'd pull the plug and it had come out crumbly, smelling like old mushrooms, and she'd say nothing at all and chalk a big X on the butt. Those 43 went in their own stack, off by the fence line. Not garbage. Fence posts, corner braces, gate hangers. Waste is just a failure of imagination. Earl wrote that on the inside cover, and she'd read it enough times by now that it came up on its own, unasked, every time she was about to throw something away. And somewhere in those 11 weeks, she figured out something the Extension Office would never have told her, because the Extension Office doesn't think in poles. A treated pine pole outlasts sawn lumber, and not mostly because of the chemical. It's the shape. A sawn 6x6 is cut out of a log. You slice through the grain, you open the ends of every fiber tube in the tree, and every one of those open ends is a straw waiting to suck up water. A pole is the tree. Bark peeled. Nothing cut but the 2 ends. The grain runs unbroken from butt to tip, following the natural taper, and the tension fibers laid down on the tree's windward side are still doing the exact job they spent 60 years learning. You didn't interrupt anything, you just borrowed it. That's why a pole set in 1948 comes out of the ground in 1979, still ringing hard when you hit it with a hammer, while a treated post from the co-op goes punky in 12 years. She wrote that down. Half a page, her handwriting crowding into the corners the way Earl's used to. Then the weather quit playing. Storm came through the second week of December. 3 days of it, 4 inches of rain on ground already saturated, and the field turned to a slop that grabbed the truck to the axle and held on. She got stuck once and spent 5 hours getting out with a come-along and a chained oak. She didn't try again. That kind of stubborn gets you a broken drivetrain and a lien. So she worked nights instead. Kitchen table, 1 bulb, a roll of butcher paper weighted at the corners with a coffee can, a coffee cup, a hammer, and the brass-cased folding rule out of her right hip pocket. Earl's initials stamped into the end of it, worn shallow by 50 years of thumbs. She drew the barn. 60 feet by 100. 24 main posts, 12 down each long wall, spaced a hair over 18 feet on center. She figured pole depth at 5 feet in that clay, which meant a 35-foot pole gave her 30 above grade, which gave her a clear span tall enough to drive a loaded hay truck through without ducking. She checked her math 4 times and got 4 different answers on the diagonal before she remembered what he'd shown her about a 3-4-5 triangle and got it right on the 5th. Have you ever sat up past midnight doing arithmetic for a building nobody thinks you're going to build? The poles kept coming when the ground firmed. Pole 400 in February. Pole 460 in early March, the last of the long ones. And then a week of nothing but tops and shorts. Pole 500 came up the drive on a cold, bright Tuesday, and she rolled it off with a cant hook onto the stack. 9 tiers high, 300 feet of stacked timber lining the north pasture like a stockpile for a war. She stood there a minute, both feet planted, hands open at her sides, the wisps loose at her temples. Then she went to the shed for the ranging poles, walked out into the empty grass with a sledge and a spool of mason's line, and drove the first stake into ground that had never held anything but weeds. 24 stake flags snapping in the wind across an empty pasture. Orange plastic on wire, bent sideways by a January gust coming off the Gulf, each one marking a hole that didn't exist yet. That was the barn. That was the whole thing, on the ground, in the dirt, where you could walk it. Greta walked it that morning with the brass folding rule in her right hip pocket and the black canvas journal under her arm, the rubber band still around it the way Earl kept it. She'd read the embedment page maybe 40 times by then. He'd written it in pencil, in that cramped square hand of his. 1/3 of the load height in the ground, never less than 8 feet in this soil. Gumbo clay will hold a pole like a fist, but only if you go deep enough to reach the fist. 40-foot poles, 13 feet of them going underground. Do the math on that for a second. She had 500 cast-off utility poles stacked on her land, most of them longer than a school bus, and the plan required her to bury 1/3 of every single one. Not lean them, not brace them, bury them, so the pole itself became the foundation. No concrete footing, no pier, no slab. The post is the footing. That's the whole idea behind a pole barn, and it's why the things stand through hurricanes when stick-frame houses fold like wet cardboard. She priced a rented auger truck out of Gulfport, $200 a day, plus the operator. And the operator wouldn't come out past the county road because the low field had standing water in it, and he wasn't burying his rig in Mississippi mud for anybody. So she rented a 2-man auger and ran it alone, which is a thing you shouldn't do. And she did it anyway, belly braced against the handle, boots wide, red laces caked. It chewed the first 4 feet like cornbread. Then, at 5 feet, it stopped. Clay lens. A hard gray seam, maybe 18 inches thick, packed so dense the auger flights just polished it and spat. She killed the motor, stood in the wind with her braid whipping loose at the temples and her hands hanging open at her sides. And she thought about it the way Earl thought about things, which meant slowly and out loud to nobody. Then she went and got the post hole digger and the 6-foot steel spud bar. Here's the part people don't understand about hand digging a 13-foot hole. You don't dig it. You chip it. You drop the spud bar, 40-some pounds of steel, straight down until the clay fractures. Then you clam the loose stuff out with the diggers. Then you drop the bar again. Down at 9-10 feet, you're working blind by feel. Your shoulder in the hole up to the armpit, and the spoil pile beside you is taller than your knee. She got through that clay lens in 4 hours on the first hole, 2.5 on the second. By the 6th hole, she'd learned to wet the seam with a bucket the night before, and it came apart in slabs. 24 holes, every one of them hand-finished below 5 feet. Setting a 40-foot pole alone is the part where most people would have hired help or quit. She didn't have money for the first and wasn't built for the second. So she rigged a gin pole, a shorter pole, 20 feet, set plumb beside the hole with a block at the top and a cable running to the truck bumper. The big pole got its butt end walked into the hole on a plank so it wouldn't crumble the sidewall. Then the truck crept forward and the cable took it up, degree by degree, until it stood shivering against the sky. 2 guy lines off the top, staked at opposing angles. A 4-foot level strapped to the pole face, checked on 2 perpendicular sides, because a pole plumb in one direction and leaning in the other is just a slow-motion collapse. She'd tighten one guy a half turn, walk around, check the other face, tighten the second a quarter, around and around. One woman and a stick of creosoted pine taller than the courthouse. Then the backfill, which is where every cheap pole barn in America dies. Earl had a full page on it. Dirt rots poles. Not the wood being underground. Poles rot at the ground line, right where air and water meet, because water sits in the loose fill and just sits and sits. So you don't backfill with dirt. You backfill with crushed limestone, number 57, in 6-inch lifts, and you tamp each lift with the end of a steel bar until it rings hard. 6 inches, tamp. 6 inches, tamp. 26 lifts per hole. The stone locks around the butt like a collar, and it drains. Water runs through it instead of standing against the wood. She hauled it in with a borrowed dump trailer, 11 tons the first load, at $9.40 a ton. Pole number 3 settled overnight. Half an inch, maybe. You'd have to look for it. She found it at first light with the level and stood there a long while, freckled nose red from the cold, gray-blue eyes going flat. Half an inch at the base is 4 inches of lean at the top of a 40-foot pole, and every truss after it inherits the error. She pulled it, dug the stone back out by hand, wrapped the cable, walked it out of the hole, found the soft pocket she'd missed at 11 feet, chipped it clean, and started the whole thing over. 10 hours to fix a mistake nobody but her would ever have seen. That was the day the White County car eased up on the shoulder and Donald Pruitt got out with the steel clipboard against his chest, chin tipped back, oxblood shoes finding the one dry spot in 100 yards of mud. The wire-rimmed glasses caught the light. He looked at the poles. He looked at her. You do understand these are decommissioned distribution poles, Miss Hollis. They're rated for wire. They are not engineered for structural use. Nobody's going to sign off on a barn built out of the district's garbage by a girl with a shovel. He said garbage like he was doing her a kindness. She wiped her hands on her thighs. I'll need that in writing. Behind her, the first 8 poles stood plumb in their holes, backfilled and tamped, dark against a winter sky. His taillights went small and red down the gravel, and then they were gone. And Greta didn't watch them go. She was already back on her knees with the tamping bar, working crushed limestone down around post number 9 in 6-inch lifts, 40 strokes a lift, the way the Black Journal said. That's the whole answer to a man like Donald Pruitt. You don't argue. You tamp. Here's what he left behind, though, and it wasn't nothing. He'd stopped at the county building office on his way through town, a courtesy call, he'd have said, a neighborly heads up. And by the time Greta drove in on a Tuesday with her hand-drawn plans rolled under her arm, there was a problem waiting for her with a name on it. The clerk was polite. The clerk was always polite. That's how these things get done, not with a fist, with a form. We don't have a precedent for round pole framing, he said, turning her sheet a quarter turn like the drawing might make more sense sideways. Dimensional lumber, we've got tables for. Steel, we've got tables for. Poles? There's no line for that. I can't approve what I can't look up. So the permit went on a clipboard. Not denied, stalled. That's the crueler move, and every small-town office in America knows it. Denial you can appeal. A stall just sits there and eats your winter. Greta stood at that counter with her braid over one shoulder and her hands open at her sides and said one thing. Then I'll bring you numbers you can look up. She drove to Gulfport on a Thursday and found a man named Verlon Spates, retired 31 years from a structural firm, living in a brick ranch house with a drafting table still set up in the carport because his wife wouldn't have it in the den. He was 81. He had a slide rule and a calculator, and both worked. She asked what it would cost to run wind load calculations on a 24-post round pole frame, 60 by 40, in Jackson County, Mississippi. He said $200. She wrote him a check on the spot, and here's the part I want you to sit with. That $200 was more than she'd spent on the poles. The poles were free. The engineering cost more than the building. She paid it anyway, because Earl Hollis had written, in a hand that pressed hard enough to dent the page, "A good idea that can't prove itself is just a rumor." Spates took 9 days. He came out to the property himself, hobbled the mudline with a cane in one hand, put a tape on the butt of post 4, and looked up the length of it for a long time without saying anything. Then he ran the numbers. Design wind speed, 140 miles an hour. That's not a guess. That's the coastal exposure category, 3-second gust, the number a Gulf county has to survive. He calculated overturning moment at the base, uplift on the connections, bending stress at the point of maximum lateral load. And every number came back with room to spare. Not barely passing, not squeaking through. The frame Earl Hollis had sketched in a black canvas journal 40 years earlier with a carpenter's pencil by a kerosene lamp in a house with no engineering degree in it ran a safety factor north of 2 on every controlling case. Spates set his pencil down and said, "Whoever drew this understood how wood fails." And that's the pivot. That's the thing nobody in that county had put together, including Greta. Until an 81-year-old man with a slide rule said it out loud. Those poles were never lumber. They were never scrap. Every one of them had been engineered by a utility, by a real firm with real money, to stand in open ground and hold a suspended cable through a Gulf hurricane. Pressure treated to a retention level that beat anything on a lumberyard rack. Tapered so the strongest fiber sat where the bending stress was worst. Selected, graded, and rated for lateral load before Greta was born. A small noise. A man in wire-rimmed glasses writing off 240 poles as a $75 a pole disposal problem. A catastrophic failure. The utility district had been paying to bury, burn, and haul away the single strongest structural material available in 3 counties for 11 years because nobody in that office could read a spec sheet they'd written themselves. Pruitt called them waste. They were pre-certified hurricane structure. He'd been standing on a fortune in his own yard, tapping a clipboard, sneering at a woman in logging boots for wanting the trash. Have you ever had somebody hand you the answer while explaining why you're too dumb to have questions? The county stamped the permit 11 days after Spates's calculations hit the counter. No apology, just a stamp. That's how it works. Then came the hard part, and I want to be honest about it, because this is where she screwed up. To carry the header beams, the round posts needed flat seats, notches cut into the curve so the beam had something square to sit on. She started on post 7 with a chainsaw and a chisel, and she cut too deep. Went past the sapwood, past the treated shell, 3.5 inches into a 9-inch post, right at the exact height where the bending stress runs highest. She stepped back and looked at what she'd done and felt her stomach drop. That post was compromised. Not ruined, compromised. And a compromised post in a hurricane frame is worse than no post, because it fails first and takes its neighbors with it. Worse still, she'd have to do that same cut 23 more times, and every one of them was a chance to do it again. So she stopped, sat on a limestone pile in the cold with the brass rule out of her hip pocket, opening and closing it, thinking. The answer wasn't a better notch. The answer was no notch at all. She drove to a salvage yard in Pascagoula and bought 1/4-inch steel plate cut into 8x14 rectangles, 48 of them, drilled for 5/8 galvanized through bolts. 2 plates per post, 1 on each face, sandwiching the header. The beams sat on steel, not on wood. Not one fiber removed from any post. Stronger than what Earl drew. Stronger than the original plan. She bolted the ruined post's plates on with an extra pair and moved on. By the second week of February, all 24 stood in a full ring, plumb, backfilled, tamped, steel plates gleaming raw at 14 feet. And on a still later, the header beam came down onto its steel plates and made a sound like a door closing in an empty house. Not a bang, a settle. 12 feet of doubled cypress dropped the last half-inch under its own weight, and every post in that ring took the load at once and didn't move. Greta stood under it with her head tipped back, the loose braid hanging down her spine, wisps stuck to her temples with sweat, and she listened to that sound the way some people listen to a heartbeat on a stethoscope. Then she climbed down and did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic didn't care how good the beam sounded. $4,100. Gone. That was the sawmill's blade sharpening bill, the steel plates and the anchor bolts, the cement, the diesel for the borrowed backhoe, the $1,200 she'd handed a man in Wiggins for the used pump, and the 200 feet of black pipe, the bags of lime, the hardware, the gaskets, the 2 tires she had to buy for the truck in February because you can't haul cypress on cord. She kept every receipt in a coffee can on the windowsill. $611 left in the passbook. The roofing wasn't bought. That's the part that'll turn your stomach if you've ever run a job on a shoestring. She had the whole skeleton up, 24 posts, the header ring, the sills notched and pinned, and no roof. And an open frame in Mississippi in April is not a building. It's a very expensive place for rain to fall. So the bank called. Of course the bank called. They always smell it. $18,000 secured against the land. 60 acres of Earl Hollis's dirt with a lien on it like a collar on a dog. The loan officer had a nice voice and a nicer offer, and the papers came in a manila envelope with a little tab where you sign. And Greta carried that envelope into the kitchen and set it on the table and did not open it for 4 days. Donald Pruitt heard about it before she'd read the first page. Small county. He came down the gravel with his clipboard held flat against his chest, the wire-rimmed glasses catching the light, weight rocking back on those polished oxblood shoes like the mud might be contagious. "I hear the bank's carrying you now," he said, and smiled the way a man smiles at a dog that's learned a trick. "That's good, that's responsible. Because between you and me, honey, this was always going to end with somebody else's money. Girls playing farmer out here. It's cute for a season. Then the note comes due, and the county buys the land at auction for a song, and everybody moves on. Your granddaddy died broke doing exactly this. You know that, right? You're just a slower version of the same mistake." He said it kindly. That's the trick with men like Pruitt. The cruelty comes wrapped in concern. So if you flinch, you're the unreasonable one. Greta stood squared up, weight even, hands open at her sides, the brass folding rule in her right hip pocket. She didn't answer him. She looked at the clipboard until he tucked it tighter against his chest. And then she looked at the road, and after a while, he took the hint and drove off. Silence is a hell of a closing argument. Then it rained. Not a shower. 6¼ inches in 31 hours. The kind of Gulf Coast rain that comes sideways and doesn't stop to breathe. The site was cut into a slope, and the drainage trench she'd hand-dug along the north edge, 140 feet, 4 feet deep, straight as a chalk line, filled, saturated, and let go. The sidewall sheared and slumped. 40 feet of it collapsed inward, took the string lines with it, buried the pipe bedding she'd graded to 1/4 inch of fall per 10 feet, and dumped enough clay slurry against the north sills that it stood 11 inches deep at the low corner. 2 weeks of work, gone in a night. She stood out in it at dusk in her canvas shirt gone black with water, boots sunk past the red laces, watching the trench she'd cut with a shovel and a level and her own back turn into a pudding. And there was nothing to do about it. You can't shovel water. You can't argue with a slope. Have you ever put every dollar and every hour you had into a thing and watched weather undo it in a single night? And then gone inside to a kitchen where a loan offer was sitting on the table with a little tab where you sign. 2 in the morning. Rain still going on the window glass, steady, indifferent. 1 bulb over the table. Her hair down out of the braid and drying in ropes. Freckles standing out on skin gone pale with cold. The thumbprint birthmark below her left ear. $18,000 would buy the roofing, the second pump, the gravel, the labor to recut the trench with a machine instead of a shovel. It would buy the finish. It would also put a rope around the only thing Earl had left her. She read the first page, then the second. Then she sat with the pen in her hand for 11 minutes and did not touch it to paper. At some point, she got up, put on the wet boots, and walked out to the old shed with a flashlight. Inside, everything smelled like linseed oil and cold metal. His slick and his corner chisels racked on the pegs, the handles worn to the shape of a hand that wasn't hers. She put her palm on the draw knife and left it there. The field journal was on the bench where she'd left it, rubber band pushed down to the spine, open to a page in his blocky pencil. Water don't fight you, it just keeps its own schedule. Waste is just a failure of imagination, including wasting a flood. She read it twice. Somewhere under the rain drumming on the tin, the arithmetic rearranged itself. A trench that collapses is a trench cut at the wrong angle. That's not a disaster. That's a measurement. She walked back to the house, hung the shirt over the chair. Didn't burn anything, didn't shout, didn't call anybody. She just didn't sign. At 2 a.m., she sat at the kitchen table with the bank's offer squared up beside Earl's open journal, the pen capped, the rain going on, and she looked at both of them a long time. She didn't sign it. She didn't tear it up either. She just left the papers where they lay, square to the edge of the table, like a thing she'd decided to stop being afraid of. And at 5:10, she pulled on her boots with the red laces and walked out into a dawn the color of wet ash. The trench had collapsed again overnight, 40 feet of it, the west run, the sandy wall sloughing in like sugar off a spoon. She looked at it for maybe 4 seconds. Then she got the shovel. Have you ever wagered everything on an idea no one else believed in? Not a little. Everything. The land, the name, the years you'd get back if you quit now and went and worked at the shipyard like a sensible person. There's a particular kind of morning where the math says stop and your hands say dig, and the only way through is to let your hands win. Greta let her hands win. She recut the trench at a shallower batter, a 1-to-1 slope instead of the near vertical she'd been fighting. And it held, because sand doesn't argue with geometry, only with pride. But holding trench walls doesn't buy roofing. She had 43 poles stacked at the north end of the yard that the co-op inspector had rejected. "Too much sweep," he'd said, tapping his pen. "Off spec," meaning they curved a half-inch more over 16 feet than a utility crossarm chart allowed, meaning nothing at all to a cow. So she called every cattleman between Wiggins and the county line and told them she had heart-treated pine, 8-foot cuts, 6-inch tops, $22 apiece, cash, U-Haul. Fence posts don't care about sweep. A crooked post in a straight fence just means you set it crooked side to the wire and forget about it. She cut the 43 into 112 posts on the buzzsaw over 4 days, stacked them in tens, and sold every one. $960. $960 that Donald Pruitt had classified as garbage. That's the part that ought to sit in your teeth a little. The man in the pressed navy jacket with the chained ballpoint had stood in her yard and told her, in that patient voice people use on the slow, that she was sitting on a pile of expensive firewood, that her grandfather had been a stubborn old man playing at engineering, and that she should be grateful anybody from the district even drove out. He rocked back on his oxblood shoes when he said it, rocked back like a man who's never once been wrong in a room where it counted. His trash bought her roof. The roof was the hard part, and she knew it, because a pole barn doesn't fail in the poles, it fails in the connections. Wind doesn't push a building over so much as it peels it, lifts the roof, and once the roof's gone, the walls fall outward like a box with the lid pulled off. Earl had drawn it out on page 91, a little stick sketch with an arrow labeled suction, not push, and underneath, in pencil pressed hard enough to emboss the next page, a rectangle folds, a triangle don't. So she made triangles. Knee braces, short lengths of 6-inch pole, cut on the miter at 45 degrees, running from each column up to the truss beam it carried. Every one of them turned a right-angle joint into a rigid triangle, and a triangle can't rack. Push on it and it doesn't lean. It just transfers the load down the diagonal into the post, and from the post into 4 feet of tamped sand and gravel. She cut and fitted 18 of them. Each cut took her about 40 minutes, because a compound angle on a round pole is not a thing you eyeball, and she checked every one with the brass-cased folding rule from her right hip pocket, her grandfather's initials worn shallow in the end cap. Nails she skipped entirely. A nail holds by friction. Pull hard enough, long enough, in a wind that's been gusting for 6 hours, and a nail walks. So she went to through bolts, half-inch galvanized carriage bolts driven clean through the joint with a washer and nut on the far side, so the load bears on steel and wood in shear, not on the grip of a shank. And at every truss-to-column connection, a hurricane strap. A strip of 20-gauge galvanized steel wrapped over the beam and lagged down both faces of the post, tying the roof to the ground in one unbroken line of metal. 1,800 bolts. She bought them in 25-pound kegs from a marine supply in Gulfport, because galvanized holds up in salt air and plain steel turns to orange lace in 4 years. $612 of the $960 went to bolts and straps. She drilled every hole with a brace and a ship auger when the generator was down, which was often. Her palms cracked and healed and cracked again. On the 9th of June, a tractor came up the drive. Lowell Bracey didn't call ahead. He didn't get out and make a speech. He backed a front-end loader into the yard, looked at the truss she was trying to walk up a ramp alone with a come-along and a prayer, and said one thing, straw hat still in the cab. "That'll kill you doing it that way." Then he lifted trusses for 2 days and left. No apology. Nobody in that county has ever apologized out loud in the history of the place. He just showed up with 3,000 pounds of hydraulic lift, set 9 trusses in 11 hours, ate the sandwich she handed him standing at the tailgate, and on the second evening drove off with the loader arms bouncing and never mentioned it again. By July, the frame stood. 64 feet by 40, 18 poles, 9 trusses, every joint triangulated, 1,800 bolts catching the light. From the road, it looked like the skeleton of something serious, and the talk at the feed store changed key. Not to praise, God no, just from laughter down to whispers. Men who'd made jokes about the Hollis girl and her firewood now looked at their coffee when her truck pulled in. That's the sound of a county revising its opinion. It's very quiet. On the 11th of August, she set the last roof purlin, ran the bolt through, and torqued the nut down with the wrench in both hands. 8 months to the day from the first pull. Purlins bolted, tin going up sheet by sheet, and out in the Gulf, a low-pressure system nobody wanted to talk about started tightening its coil. Greta was on the ladder with a screw gun and a mouthful of hex screws when the radio in the truck cut from a weatherbed to a bulletin. Warning by Thursday. Landfall somewhere between Pascagoula and Bay St. Louis, which was a fancy way of saying right on top of her. She got the north slope covered. Half the south slope was still bare rafters and open sky. Wednesday afternoon, a truck came up her drive, and Lowell Bracey got out with that sweat-stained straw hat already in both hands, the gray mustache working like he was chewing something bitter. He didn't waste time. He'd been told to move his herd, and he had 81 head and 1 steel frame pole building put up in 1978 by a company out of Jackson that had since gone under. "I don't like asking," he said. "Don't have to like it," Greta said. "Open the gate." 4 words. That was the whole negotiation. They drove the cattle over the ditch line and up the pasture road in the last dry hour before the outer bands hit. 81 head plus her own into a barn with half a roof and no walls at all. Just those 41 poles standing in the dark like a stand of trees that had agreed to hold still. Bracey looked up at the rafters and said nothing. He'd watched her set every one of those posts, and he'd said, publicly, at the feed store, that a woman who buries a tree upside down and calls it a building is going to bury herself with it. He put his cattle under it anyway. The wind came up around 9 that night. You've maybe heard a hurricane described as a roar. It isn't. It's pressure. It's the sensation of a hand pushing steadily on your eardrums, and underneath that, a low freight train hum that never crests and never breaks, hour after hour. And inside that hum, 100 smaller sounds. Tin somewhere shrieking, a fence wire singing, pine tops snapping off 200 yards away with a crack like a rifle. Sustained 115. Gust past 130 on the anemometer at the airfield before the anemometer left. Greta sat in the truck cab at the top of the pasture with the headlights off and the rain going sideways across the glass in sheets and watched her barn. She could see it in the lightning. Every few seconds, a white flash, and there it stood, the frame flexing. That's the part nobody expected. And it's the part Earl had written down in that black canvas journal 40 years before in his cramped pencil hand under a heading that just said, Wind. A square sawn post presents a flat face to a gust. Wind hits a flat face and stops, and everything it was carrying transfers straight into the joint. A round post doesn't stop it. A round post sheds it. Air peels around the curve and keeps going, and the load that reaches the joint is maybe 2/3 what a sawn timber would have eaten. Same wood, different shape. That's it. That's the whole trick. And the second trick was underground. 5 feet of embedment on every post, backfilled with tamped native clay in 6-inch lifts, and the butt end down, the fat end, the dense end, the end that grew closest to the ground. Each of those posts was a cantilever. A steel building sits on anchor bolts in a concrete pad, and when the wind lifts, the bolts are the whole argument. Greta's barn didn't have that argument. Her barn had 5 feet of Mississippi clay locked around 41 round shafts of pressure-treated pine, and to lift it, you'd have to lift the field. So it moved. That's what she saw in the lightning. The whole frame leaning maybe 2 inches downwind at the eave, and then coming back. Leaning and coming back. Green wood in a hurricane behaves like a mast. It gives, it stores the load, it returns it. Rigid things don't give. Rigid things break at the weld and go somewhere else. Have you ever sat in the dark and watched the thing you spent everything on decide whether it was going to live? She didn't sleep. Around 2, the eye wall came through, and the pressure dropped so hard her ears popped in the cab, and for 11 minutes it went quiet and stupid calm. And she got out and stood in the wet grass and heard 81 cows breathing under a half-finished roof. Not bawling, breathing. Then the backside hit from the opposite quarter and shoved the whole frame the other direction, and it leaned, and it came back. Dawn was gray and flat and smelled like broken pine. 3 sheets of tin were gone off the north slope. She found one of them 90 yards out in the bean stubble, folded over like a bad hand of cards. That was the damage. 3 sheets, $14 apiece. She walked the whole structure with the brass folding rule out of her right hip pocket, checking plumb on every post, and found one at 3/4 of an inch off and 40 at dead true. And she stood there in the wet with the braid soaked flat down her back and her gray-blue eyes going up and down that line of poles, and didn't say one word out loud. The county said something else. 14 steel-frame agricultural buildings in the district, 9 flat. Bracey's 1978 building had peeled its roof off in one piece, dropped it in a slough, and then folded its walls inward like a cardboard box somebody stepped on. Not a stick of it worth saving. Insurance called it a total. And out on Highway 63, the utility district's own maintenance yard, the yard Donald Pruitt ran, the man who'd stood in her drive with that steel clipboard against his chest and told her, smiling, that people who can't afford to do things properly shouldn't be surprised when properly does them in. The utility district's pole shed lost its entire east wall and about 60 feet of roof. A pole shed, built out of poles, by professionals, with a permit. The difference wasn't luck. The difference was 5 feet down and round on the outside. The sun broke through a little after 7, and a truck came slow up her drive, splashing through the ruts, and stopped, and Lowell Bracey got out with his hat already in both hands. He didn't apologize. Men like Lowell Bracey don't. He stood on her porch with the sweat-stained straw hat turning in both hands, the gray mustache working, and he said, "Those posts, how deep?" 5 foot, Greta said. Charred to a 1/4 inch, brushed, then setting gravel to the frost line. No concrete collar. Concrete holds water against the wood. He looked at her a long moment, feet wide, slow to move. The reddish birthmark below his right ear gone dark in the cold. Then he put out his hand. That handshake was the first honest question anyone in that county had ever asked her. She walked him out to the barn afterward and let him put his own thumbnail into a post. She held out the brass folding rule from her right hip pocket, her grandfather's initials stamped in the end, and let him measure the char depth himself. 41 minutes at the firebox, she told him. Muslin strip at the opening to read the draft. Turn the pole a quarter every 10. He wrote none of it down. He didn't have to. He'd just watched his own steel building fold like a beer can while hers stood there with the honey-blonde braid of smoke still hanging off the ridge vent. Within 18 months, 4 neighbors built pole barns to her plan. She charged nothing, not a dollar. That startled people more than the barns did. What she asked for instead was the numbers back: post depth, char time, species, gravel gradation, and a written note every spring on any post that showed rot at the ground line. Bracy filled out his first sheet in pencil and mailed it in an envelope like a man paying a debt. By 1989, she had 14 sheets in a shoebox and not one report of failure below grade. 14 sheets is not science. 14 sheets is a beginning, and she knew the difference. And then, of course, the system came back around. Donald Pruitt drove up her lane in April, navy suit jacket pressed, oxblood shoes picking their way around the puddles like the mud had personally offended him. Same steel clipboard against his chest, chained pen swinging. Same thin gold wire rims. Same chin tipped back, weight rocking on the heels. You remember what he said to her the first time. That she was a girl playing with her grandfather's garbage. That the district had a disposal problem, and she had a hobby, and hobbies don't survive an audit. That she should be grateful anybody bothered to explain the paperwork to her twice. He'd smiled the whole time he said it. That was always the ugliest part, the patience of him, the way he handed her contempt like a brochure. Now he stood in her yard and said, "We've got another 800 coming out of the ground on the coastal loop. Cedar butts, some pine. I'm told you might be interested in taking them." Told. Not by him. By an insurance adjuster, most likely, or by his own supervisor, who'd started asking why the district was paying $75 a pole to landfill something a woman 10 miles out was building barns from for free. Greta stood squared, weight even, hands open at her sides, that faint sun flush across her cheeks. She let him wait. "I'll take them," she said. "Delivered to my gate. Stacked, not dumped. $20 a pole, paid to me. And I'll need a receipt." Pruitt blinked. "Paid to you?" "You were paying $75 to bury them. I'm cheaper. Those are my terms." He wrote it down. Of course he wrote it down. That's the thing about a man who is really just a system wearing glasses. He has no principles to be wounded, only line items. She didn't beat him. She made him irrelevant. And then she made him a customer. He signed the sheet on his own steel clipboard and drove off. And in 11 years, she never heard him say one word about her grandfather again. Have you ever had the person who mocked you hand you a check with a straight face? After that, it moved the way these things always move, sideways, quietly, without credit. An insurance adjuster from Hattiesburg photographed her barn for a claims file, and those photos ended up in a training packet. The Agricultural Extension Office put out a 4-page bulletin in 1990 on charred post pole construction for coastal wind loading. And the diagram of the firebox with the muslin draft indicator was, line for line, a page out of Earl Hollis's black canvas-bound journal. They didn't name her. She didn't ask them to. In 1991, a farm paper out of Jackson ran 1,100 words under a photograph of her standing beside a post, braid over her shoulder. And the writer asked what her grandfather would have made of it. And she said he'd have wanted the numbers. 16 years pass in the space of a breath. 2 more named storms came up out of the Gulf and went over that land, and the barn stood through both of them. In 2007, she pulled 4 posts on the west line, the oldest ones, in the ground 23 years, and sawed them through at grade, sapwood clean, char layer intact, black and dry as a spent match. She sounded every remaining post with a hammer that spring, 140 of them, and got the same answer every time, a hard, bright knock. Sound and sound. The apprentice was a woman in her early 20s from up near Wiggins, and she was learning the parbuckle rig the same way Greta had. Badly, then less badly. You run the line under the pole, back over, take a turn on the sled. 2 ropes, 1 slope, 1 woman rolling 400 pounds of cedar uphill without a machine. The girl let the tail slip on her first try, and the pole rolled back and took the shin out from under a sawhorse. Greta didn't say a word, just reset the sawhorse and pointed at the line. She was silver now, the braid gone white-gray down her back, the freckles faded, the thumbprint birthmark below her ear still there under the collar of the same olive canvas shirt. At the end of that season, she brought out 2 things and set them on the tailgate. The black canvas-bound field journal, rubber band around it, soft as cloth at the corners. And the brass folding rule, initials worn shallow from 40 years of pockets. "They're yours," she said. "Write in it. Don't just read it." The girl held the rule like it might come apart. "Waste is just a failure of imagination," Greta said. "Somebody's always throwing away the good part." Then she walked back to the barn to sound the posts one more time. "And there is one on that west line with a knock so clean it'll outlive everyone who ever laughed. Go find out whose initials are C."